finished with the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga was seen as the turning point of the American Revolution in hindsight. And that's because before that, the Continental Army suffered a few setbacks. Right, they had some successes in New England, in Boston, Bunker Hill, and Lexington, Concord. Um, but the British come in full force once war is officially declared with the Declaration of Independence, and they come and they conquer in 1777. They take control of New York during the Battle of Brooklyn. Again, Washington has some success at Trenton in New Jersey, right? But overall, a lot of these major battles end in losing for the Americans. In particular, also after the Battle of Brooklyn, we also have the conquering of Philadelphia. The British take control of the colonial capital. And so things weren't looking great. But the Battle of Saratoga was a major conflict, and it led to a major British general losing and formally surrendering, right? And this was enough to kind of convince the French that the American army, the Continental Army, had some hope, right? And so they began providing more resources, more supplies, and more soldiers, actually military soldiers. And so these things all kind of lead to then a turning point. From there, the Continental Army will eventually prevail. Things still were not all great and rosy, right? One example of that is Valley Forge, which is in Pennsylvania. And so in the winter of 1777 to 1778, George Washington takes his troops after the success at Trenton, and they encamp at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. And they plan to spend the winter there. They're not going to fight during the winter. That's not something that really happened at this time. Fighting took place in the spring and summer months more. But it was a brutally cold winter during this time period. Freezing, constant snow, and many of his soldiers either, they're all malnourished, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough clothing. Many of them freeze to death, they die of other disease. And it's close to 20% of Washington's army perishes during this winter encampment. So definitely a huge setback, but in some regards it helps kind of build this bond between the soldiers, and it does give Washington time to better train his army. And so he has the help of a Prussian general who comes from Prussia, which is the precursor to modern-day Germany, and comes to the colonies to help with the independence effort. And so his man, Friedrich von Steuben, who is a professional military general, more experienced in Washington, trains the Continental Army and gets them prepared for the next season of fighting. Skipping ahead to the end, we're not going to focus too much on any particular conflict, battle, but one important thing to know is that the war essentially ends with the victory, the Continental victory at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. And so New England is still kind of predominantly controlled by the Continental Army. The middle colonies, the British have control of, like New York and Philadelphia. And then, so the British decide then to focus their efforts on the southern colonies. And they are led by a man named Charles Cornwallis, who's one of the most successful British generals of this time period. And he has some successes in conquering Charleston, South Carolina. He moves through North Carolina as well, moving north into Virginia, where he encamps at the city or the town of Yorktown. And so this is where the major showdown is going to happen. But while this is all happening, while the British are moving north through the southern colonies, we have to keep in mind, right, after the Battle of Saratoga, the French agree to provide more help, more aid. And so they send soldiers over, and generals and leaders to help. And one of these people is a man named Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French noble who was an ardent supporter of the American efforts at independence because of what it stood for, this idea of representative government, the Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, right? This was something Lafayette believed in, and he wanted to help. So he lobbied France for reinforcements to get more soldiers, and really importantly, to get their navy to come, or part of the navy to come to help fight the war. And he helps to train soldiers. He's one of Washington's right-hand men, and together they're able to successfully defeat the British. And so at the time of Yorktown, you have George Washington and his army. They're moving south as well to kind of meet and deal with this issue. They kind of, for the time period, he's giving up on New York and Philadelphia. You have 6,000 French troops land in the colonies, ready to help and fight. You also have the French Navy has arrived, and they defeat the British in a battle in Chesapeake Bay, which is in Maryland. And that actually traps some of the British troops from going down to Virginia to help Cornwallis. Then in October 1781, so this is about 4 years or so after the Battle of Brooklyn, after the Philadelphia is conquered, after Valley Forge, you have this 3-week Battle of Yorktown. Ultimately, because he's surrounded by both American and French soldiers, and because British reinforcements were prevented from arriving because of the French Navy, Cornwallis is forced to surrender at Yorktown. And this is kind of the largest segment of the army at this time, the military, and it's considered the last major battle of the Revolution. It's not the very last battle, but it's the last major battle. There's some skirmishes that happen afterwards, but ultimately, the Treaty of Paris, which formally ends the Revolutionary War, is signed in 1783, so 2 years after the last battle. Keep in mind, right, there were some smaller skirmishes going on, but you have to also keep in mind that this is not instant, rapid communication and transportation like we have today. It took time to move troops. It could take weeks or months to move troops from one location to another, to get them from the British islands, right, to the North America. It could take months, right, and so things were a bit slower moving. And so that's why the last major battle was in 1781, but the war's not formally ended until 1783. But what this treaty does is it confirms U.S. independence. The British recognize U.S. independence, as well as other European nations recognize it as well. So that gives kind of international credence or international support behind the revolutionary movement. And it also is important because it sets the boundaries of the new nation. So in a minute, I'll show you a map of what the new nation looks like as of 1783 in the Treaty of Paris. But the American Revolution is the first time in history that the ideas of the Enlightenment, these ideas of representative government, of natural rights to life, liberty, and property, the right to overthrow governments that aren't protecting those natural rights, all those ideas have been thought about and been discussed, but this is the first time it's actually being put into practice. And so it is a pretty revolutionary moment in history, and it leads inspiration to other people and other groups. So for example, in 1789, just a couple years after this war ends, the people of France revolt against the monarchy in their country. In the early 1800s, people in Haiti rebel against the French Empire and create their own independent democratic country. And this also spreads to other parts of Europe as well. So this is a really important moment in world history and in American history. And just to kind of end here, right, it's helpful to look at this time the United States is a new thing, right, in 1783. They never existed before, so it's not really right just to look at what today would be the United States, right? It's helpful to look at a map that shows kind of who else is involved on the continent scale. And so the green here on the eastern part of the map is what becomes the new nation, right? That's the original territory of the United States of America. And so you can see there's the 13 colonies along the coast here. But also much of what becomes the Midwest of the United States, places like Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, right? That all is also part of the original territory of the United States when it gets independence in 1783. This land here, again, Ohio, Michigan, and so forth, we now know it as the Midwest because the United States stretches all the way to the West Coast. But at the time, it was known as the Northwest, right? Because that was the extent of the country, the Northwest. Our understanding today as modern Americans of the Northwest would be places like Washington State and Oregon, but at this time we're talking about Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Illinois, that area. That also is initially part of it. At the time, though, we still have a large Spanish presence in the colonies, in North America, I should say. Most of the rest of the country at this time, of the future country, is part of the Spanish territory. That will eventually change over to French hands. And then eventually the United States will purchase much of this territory in orange here from the French. The British maintain control of Canada, which they will do up until Canadians really have their independence. Canada is still part of the Commonwealth of Great Britain, though, so they still have that tie to Great Britain. The French have some territories, right? Haiti, right down here in the Caribbean, and Russia along the Alaskan coast to the north here. So these are the countries that still kind of have influence in this part of the world, but we do now have the United States of America, in the eastern part and modern Midwestern part of the modern day country. So we're going to end with that for today. And the next lecture will be focusing on what kind of government the American people decide to institute or form.